Well, greetings to everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where I'm finding you. It's a real pleasure to be able to join this academic consortium, the Japan-Canada Academic Consortium, and be able to talk to the youth, students from Canada and Japan on these important issues. So at the onset, first, let me thank the organizers, the University of Waterloo and Renison for this important discussion, and you, the students who have taken the time out of your busy schedules to focus on this important bilateral relationship, Canada and Japan, and not only the positive things of this relationship, but also some of the serious global challenges we have, many of them in Japan's region, and how the two countries can look to work together to mitigate some of these risks and challenges. So let me begin with a little bit of an anecdote. And this is something that when I used to live in Japan a few years back, I remember speaking with some senior Canadian officials, and I asked what would they assess the Japan-Canada relationship looks like in a word. And the word that they used to describe the relationship was comfortable. And when they use the word comfortable, usually we think of comfortable, we think that's a positive thing, right? You know, it's that means that there's few irritations. It's not a relationship that's strained. But they weren't necessarily saying that in the most positive, descriptive tone. I think what they meant by comfortable, and I think many Japanese colleagues would agree with this, is that while the relationship is great, there's very few problems between Canada and Japan. And in many ways, not only are there few problems, there's a lot of thriving areas when it comes to people, cultural exchange, business exchange is growing, but it lacked this broader sense of sort of inspiration. So hence the title of my lecture today, which is taking this bilateral relationship between Canada and Japan beyond comfort. So moving it beyond the comfortability stage and taking it to something a bit more inspiring. So at the onset, the first point is to think about the history of this relationship and what are the starting blocks. And I think the starting blocks are good. I mean, the foundational elements of the Canada-Japan relationship are very strong. If you think in a multilateral sense, so how we work with Japan in international forums, we are in most of the clubs alongside Japan and share similar interests and values. So just a few of these, of course, include the United Nations, the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation, but also some of the other forums, such as the ASEAN Regional Forum, the Asian Development Bank, the Group of Seven, of course, and the Group of 20. So Canada and Japan remain important partners in many of the international clubs. In addition to this, we have very strong bilateral relations. Of course, on trade terms now, Canada and Japan effectively have their own free trade agreement through the newly ratified and agreement that's now entered into force, the Trans-Pacific Partnership. So things are looking quite solid. That being said, I think, and this sort of gets to the second part of my talk, is that the geostrategic context, so the context with this relationship is taking part in, is changing at a very, very quick pace. And I think some of your other presenters today will talk about this. I think students on both sides are able to recognize, and probably studying this now, how the Indo-Pacific region is changing in so many very, very quick ways. This is happening both, of course, demographically, with populations continuing to rise. This is happening economically with the economies and the market successes that we've seen, not just in China, but in India and Southeast Asia, et cetera. But it's also happening in security terms. So we're seeing, with this sort of growth and center of economic gravity in this part of the world, we're also seeing a growth of security tensions, territorial disputes, which have been there for a long time, but are increasingly becoming more and more tense. This, of course, is magnified by a global pandemic now. While the Indo-Pacific and the world is not new to pandemics, this one, I think, has created some and sort of heightened some fault lines in this region. And often one thing I will say about COVID-19, and I'm sure we're all tired of hearing about the pandemic, but is rather than COVID-19 being a distraction, I think the reality is that this pandemic actually has been a threat accelerator. So in other words, some of the challenges that were existing in this part of the world, some of the security challenges, which we'll talk about a little bit in the coming minutes, haven't gone away. And in many senses, they've actually been amplified by this atmosphere of countries looking more inwards, a little bit more protectionist on trade, and increasingly distrustful strategically. So what are a few of these challenges? So, there's a bit of a laundry list, so we won't go into all of them today. We won't be able to appreciate each challenge. But one of the main themes and one of the main areas that Canada and Japan both share strong interests in promoting and upholding is international law, and especially the international law and freedom of navigation in maritime terms. So this is fundamentally being challenged in many areas of the Indo-Pacific. I think one very close to Japan, obviously, very close to your Okinawan Islands, is the Senkaku dispute with China. So Japan's Senkaku Islands, also claimed by China and referred to as the Diaoyu. This dispute has been going on, obviously, for some time, and the tensions, the more recent tensions, I think, within the past 8 or 9 years. That being said, I think from a Canadian media perspective, we don't hear about the Senkaku as much as we might hear about Taiwan or even the South China Sea. But talking to Japanese friends, especially those who are working with the Coast Guard or those who are working in the Maritime Self-Defense Forces, we all know that this is an everyday challenge. And while nobody wants conflict between Japan and China, or between China and any other country, the possibility of an inadvertent clash is a real challenge, and something I think we need to steel ourselves for. And again, look very closely at working with like-minded partners on dispute resolution peacefully to ensure that states effectively aren't able to unilaterally, so without any sort of recourse to international law, take territory. So that's one key area. But this is not just an issue of Japan and China. I think, as many of the students attending this forum are probably hearing throughout this week, there is continued tensions in the South China Sea, which is more in Southeast Asia, with several different claimant states. Obviously, the Chinese have successfully had a dredging program and built several man-made islands in the South China Sea, and have effectively militarized those islands. There are other states who have also made some man-made islands, which I think the Chinese sometimes point to, and that's correct. That being said, I don't think any of the other states, such as Vietnam and the Philippines, have done anything to the capacity or militarized in the way that the Chinese have. So these tensions in both the South China Sea and the East China Sea are real, in addition, of course, to some of the challenges over Taiwan and Taiwan's future. The way that China may wish to resolve this is not in the interests, I think, in the security interests of many of China's neighbors, including Japan, and including some in Southeast Asia. Yeah, so this is the first point, is there's a range of different security issues. I should put a caveat here that it's not limited to China, and it's not limited just to maritime security issues. As I said, we wouldn't have the time to discuss every security issue in Asia, even if we had a day or a month. But there are other challenges in this region. Another example, of course, is the continued development of North Korea's ballistic missile program and their nuclear weapons program. I can give you another anecdote here. When I was in Japan, I remember waking up very early and my phone sort of having a jarring ring to it. And this was Japan's J alert system, which effectively your phone notifies you if there's a ballistic missile overhead over Japanese airspace. And this was where we were a few years ago with a very acute sort of uptick in tensions between North Korea, the United States, and also the United States' key allies, Japan and South Korea. So this is also an everyday challenge and threat for Japan and the region more broadly that we need to keep our attention on. And finally, in addition to resolving some of the issues with the pandemic, I think we also have to think about the short and medium and long-term challenge of climate change. This is something Japan knows very well, obviously, being a country that has dealt with several natural disasters in its history, including most recently with 3/11. But other countries in the region have been dealing with this as well, whether it's tsunamis in Indonesia, whether it's typhoons in the Philippines, whether it's flooding in South Asia. The challenges of climate change and the potential security implications of that going forward are one that I don't even think at this point that we've fully sussed out how far-reaching these consequences and implications are going to be. So it paints a bit of a gloomy picture, and I'm sorry for starting with some of the challenges, but I think we need to recognize those challenges at first in order to come up with some positive solutions. And I think this is where the Canadian side, alongside with Japan, comes into play. So what exactly have Canada and Japan been doing, and where could they be going? The first thing to note is that I think Canada and Japan generally see pretty eye to eye on many of these issues. As I said before, they both have a shared interest in promoting the rule of law. They both support, obviously, as buttressed by their membership in the Trans-Pacific Partnership, is the more high ambition or more open trade, sustainable infrastructure, and donating to states in the region that need infrastructure in a transparent way. But how can this sort of be pushed forward, I think, is one of the key questions. So back to the original theme of taking comfort and moving that to inspiring, I think Japan and Canada need to think about their relationship not being constrained in necessarily only a bilateral sense. So not only thinking of this in a bilateral relations context, and also not only thinking about this in a multilateral sense. So not only thinking that all of these challenges can be resolved through multilateral organizations. We should work in these organizations, and I think that we will continue to work with Japan very closely in organizations such as the United Nations, APEC, the World Trade Organization. But the realities of the Indo-Pacific are they're not quite able to deal with these challenges strictly on the multilateral side. So this leads to something that I often refer to as the vehicles of engagement. So how exactly should Canada, and Japan is in this boat as well, how should they address these challenges? And I think, to be honest, Japan might be a little bit ahead of us, especially being a great power in this part of the world. And having a history here, they've been aware that the multilateral way of doing things or the bilateral way exclusively is not the only way. So the third sort of track here is what I often refer to as mini-lateral engagement. This would be, for example, a range of different states working together to pursue common interests. One example of this, obviously, the most for those who are sort of interested in international security in the Indo-Pacific, I'm sure many of you have heard of the Quad, which is a four-country grouping, Japan, India, the United States, and Australia. The Quad is one example of mini-lateral states. So in this case, 4 states joining together. It's not an alliance like NATO, but it's a grouping of countries who generally share interests and values and want to find a way to promote this. Thus far, Canada has largely been on the outside when thinking about this sort of mini-lateral approach. And I think there's a couple of reasons, again, that we won't have time to get into. But generally, I think there's a need to refresh and rethink about the way that we conduct foreign policy in this part of the world. And I think there's no better or no more natural partner to do this than Japan. Japan affords us, as I said, with many of the shared interests and values we already share with Japan, it affords us essentially a gatekeeper or an open door to pursue some of those interests. And some of them can be done in tandem with Japan and other states. Perhaps that might be the Americans, it might be the French in some respects, or it might be working with Japan in partnership in areas such as Southeast Asia. The themes on which this cooperation could be, I'll leave you as the next generation to explore and give me that advice, because I very much would welcome that. But just to sort of give you a few ideas, they might be on capacity building, for example, on climate resilience. As I mentioned at the onset, one of the fundamental national security challenges and international security challenges for the Indo-Pacific, as well as the world more broadly, will be climate change. And on this point, I think Canada and Japan have recently identified climate change as one of their key areas to focus on in the Indo-Pacific. So this is one area to think about. A last sort of point to leave you on is when we think about country-to-country relations, it's very important to think about balance, especially sophisticated and evolved relations like Canada and Japan. So you have a reservoir of capital, whether it's this, yourself as one example, the exchange of students, the exchange of intellectuals, business people, culture. There is a reservoir of trust built up in this relationship. So we need to utilize that to ensure that this relationship has the proper balance and is focused and as comprehensive as a way as possible. So a few of those areas, obviously, we've already highlighted. The economic relationship is growing. That's a positive. That we now have a trade agreement in place. Investment is growing on both sides. I think there can be more done on that, but that's one positive area. But the one area, and this was the focus of our discussion today, and I think it's a big focus of your symposium this year, is on peace and security. I think Japan and Canada have talked on peace and security issues for several years, but I think in the reality, they haven't really seen each other as close security partners and defense partners until recently. And that's a shame. And I think there's several reasons for that we can't really get into right now. But in order to restore the balance of that relationship, I think that empathy is very important. When you think about international relations, it's very important to think about your partners and even your adversaries, to think about what life is like in their shoes. And one of the things I often say about Canada-Japan relations, and this would be true with Canada's relationships more broadly in the Indo-Pacific, is that it's no longer acceptable for us to travel to those countries as senior officials and ministers and focus, predominantly on what we want. It has to be a balance, obviously. You want to promote Canadian interests, but we have to understand the challenges going on in this region and what the states and what our friends are feeling. And I think Japan increasingly has quite a severe international security environment. Obviously, we referenced a few of them, some of the tensions with China, some of the growing escalations on the Korean Peninsula. In addition, I would say to an emerging Russia-China alignment and military alignment, which is concerning to Japan, as Japan still has a territorial dispute with Russia in the north. So all of these factors make it that Canada needs to, number one, empathize a bit more with Japan, but also find ways to enhance and bolster that security cooperation going forward. On that sort of note, again, I'll leave you, but my last sort of point will be that when thinking about engaging in this, so yes, we've talked about some of the different security tensions in the region. We've talked about how Canada and Japan might be able to deal with them. The important last thing is, it might seem through this discussion that all I'm talking about is governments. You know, it's the job of the Japanese foreign ministry and the Canadian foreign ministry to solve all of these issues. It could be further from the point. The reality is that you as well are a change actor. And the way that foreign policy actors have changed, especially over the past 30 to 40 years, is, I mean, it's been a complete sea change of the way foreign policy is conducted. Perhaps 30, 40 years ago, you could have one ministry or one department for a government that effectively would monopolize foreign policy. And nowadays, we see within the government several different stakeholders and partners, the several different layers of government, from federal to provincial to municipal, cities working together. And then we go outside of government. And that's, I think, where you fall in, as some of the intellectual exchange, the universities, think tanks, and private sector. All of us have a role to play in this. And I think one of the things that's nice about an evolved relationship like Canada and Japan is we have these sort of these avenues. We have these avenues to have these discussions, to think about creative policy solutions and advice. And not every policy recommendation is going to be a perfect one, but that's okay. I can tell you very much that I'm extremely excited to see some of the discussions and the outputs, and some of the thinking that you come up with out of this consortium and this symposium. And I will be reading them very closely, and very likely I may borrow some of them. So don't count yourself out. You're a very important player in this bilateral relationship too. So thank you again for the time, and looking forward to your questions.